this seminal book of the Bible, but tonight I want to spend some time to go over some of the background of this letter, the circumstances of its writing, its message and its purpose, and what we can learn from it as individual Christians and as a church today. This may turn into a series, I really don't know. That's up to the Lord, but there are definitely no shortage of lessons and wonderful truths contained in this letter from Paul. So for a little bit of background on the book of Romans, Paul the Apostle is the stated and undisputed author of this book. From the book of Acts and statements in Romans, we learn that Paul wrote this letter while he was in Corinth in the spring of AD 57. It could have possibly been winter 57 into 58 as well, but likely spring of 57. This is at the end of his third missionary journey, and he is on his way to Jerusalem to deliver an offering from the Gentile churches to poor Jewish Christians. And you can read about that in Acts 20, verse 3, and in Romans 15, verses 25 through 29, if you'd like. There was a woman named Phoebe of Cenchreae, a suburb of Corinth, that was going to Rome. And we read about that in Romans 16, the first two verses of Romans 16. And since Paul is in Corinth with Paul there, and she is traveling to Rome, he makes use of this opportunity to send this letter with her. There was no postal service in the Roman Empire except for official business. Personal letters had to be carried by friends or travelers. So this is what happens here. So all of Paul's writings grew out of his missionary/pastoral work and addressed the problems and needs of local churches. And the book of Romans is in the same genre of that, but it also differs from those other letters in that Paul had not been to Rome yet. This letter was his opportunity to expound on the gospel to the Christians there at Rome. He could use this opportunity to discuss the essence of sin, the salvation that was accomplished on the cross, the union of the believer with Christ, how the Spirit works in the Christian to promote holiness, the place of the Jewish people in God's plan, future things, and Christian living or ethics. Though Paul did not write Romans as a systematic theology, his somewhat orderly exposition has been a foundation for the development of that discipline. If you read the book of Romans from 1:1 to the end of chapter 16, it is a fairly complete outline of Christian life. He deals with sin, salvation, regeneration, the importance of grace, the importance of Christian living. If you had to choose one book to give to someone to explain Christianity, how to live as a Christian, this would be it. Paul kind of goes over a little bit of everything. So, this book is also a little bit different in that it's not necessarily written to a specific church at Rome. The other epistles to the Thessalonians and the Philippians, etc., the Corinthians, those are, say, in the initial greeting. Paul almost always, I believe always, has a salutation, a greeting at the beginning of his letters, and he always addresses the audience, and in those other letters, it's to the church. Paul does not say that here in Rome. It is long been believed that there was not necessarily one church in Rome, but a series of churches that were held in individual houses. these Christians in Rome likely go back to the visitors from Rome that we read at Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, verse 10, it says Jews and proselytes were there, while it's listing all of the various places that people at Pentecost were from. It tells us that people from Rome were there. Many of these visitors obviously believed in Jesus Christ. We read about that in Acts 2, verse 41. In Acts 18, verse 2, Luke mentioned Aquila and Priscilla, who we're all familiar with. And it says that they left Rome because Emperor Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave the city. And this was in AD 49. This exodus was caused by strife among Jews over Christ. So this means that the remaining Christians in Rome would be from a Gentile background. And the Jewish and Gentile tensions in Rome had a long history, and these tensions are somewhat reflected throughout the letter to the Romans, most specifically in chapters 2 and 11, and also 14 through 15. So Paul wrote to the Roman Christians to let them know that he was on his way to Rome, which I know I just said he's on his way to Jerusalem to deliver the donated funds to the Jews there, and that is true. But Paul states that he's going to Jerusalem, and then, as soon as possible, is going to come back to Rome. So he's on his way to Rome in a roundabout fashion. This was before God had told Paul that he would be his witness in Rome, which is in Acts 23:11, which I'll read real quick. It says, "In the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome.'" And so God had not told Paul this yet, and Paul did not yet feel sure that he would even get out of Jerusalem alive. And we see this in Romans 15:31. I'll read that real quick. It says, "That I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints." It seemed proper that Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, should leave on file in the capital of the world, Rome, a written explanation of the gospel of Christ in case he was killed and could not reach Rome. So we've laid out Paul had not yet been to Rome. He did finally arrive there 3 years after he writes this letter. As we said earlier, the nucleus of the church, the Christians there in Rome, were probably the early Christians there were probably the Jews from Rome who had been in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost. In the 28 years since Pentecost, many Christians from various parts of the East had, for one reason or another, migrated to the capital city, including some of Paul's own converts, for lack of a better term, and intimate friends. And you can read that in Romans 16, as Paul closes out his letter. He addresses some of these Christians that he knows well and has come in contact with in the past, and gives his farewell sign-off to them. So let's take a look at Rome. So all of us probably have some knowledge about the city of Rome, just from basic history. As I said earlier, this letter was likely written in 57 AD. At this time, I looked this up, there were only likely right around 30,000 people living in the city of Jerusalem. Now, obviously, it would have still been fairly compacted in, but only about 30,000 people. However, that number could swell to over 125,000 or or so people during festivals. As we saw at Pentecost, people had come from all over the Roman Empire, essentially, and likely even further. So the population was only about 30,000 people. By contrast, Rome probably passed the 1 million population mark right around this time, at the beginning of the Christian era. Rome was, for all practical purposes, the capital of the world. By the year 200 AD, Rome had reached 1.2 million people, which made it the most populous city in world history to that point. In the heart of the city, the Caesars built a magnificent array of public buildings, perhaps never equaled, even to this day. Paul, the missionary to the Gentiles, after 3 missionary journeys, has still never been to Rome, practically the capital of the Gentile world. The capital of the world, but especially the Gentile world. It was the undisputed greatest, largest city the world had known to that point. Not only was this city unfathomably enormous for people of this day and filled with impressive feats of engineering and culture, we know that the Romans also controlled all of the land around the Mediterranean Sea and even as far north as the island of Britain. The culture of the Romans as well was the predominant culture throughout the early Christian world. Paul said in Acts 19:21, after these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And in Acts 23:11, we read what we read a minute ago. It says, in the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. And also in Romans 1:15, we read, so as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. So we know that Paul desired to go to Rome. He had shared the gospel with Romans and had seen them saved. And now he desired to go and preach the whole word of God to them. There's something that I kept thinking of when I first, when this idea of looking at the background and overview of Romans came to me. One of the things that really struck me was this fact that Paul had never visited Rome. Even though he had never been to Rome, he knew of the Christians there. And it's a good reminder to us today that other Christians, members of other churches, and especially preachers of other churches, have a view and an opinion of each church, including this one, in their mind based on what they've heard and seen before they visited a particular church many, many times. I think occasionally about how there are hundreds or even thousands of versions of Ben Gordon in people's minds out there. Everyone that we come in contact with, or even people that have just heard of us or seen some of our actions, there's a version of Ben Gordon, what they think Ben Gordon is in their minds. Who we think we are and who I think I am really only exists in my mind. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's likely skewed and flawed, just as are each of those other versions. It's honestly kind of a freaky thing to think about. But it also stresses the importance of the impression that we make on people when we come in contact, even if it's not someone we know well. Subconsciously, they are drawing conclusions about who you are, what you stand for, what you believe in, just by simply meeting someone. So it's a good thing. Listen, it's kind of freaky to think about, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. It's something I think about occasionally. But I had the thought that, the same thing is true of churches. Each person that has ever walked through those doors has a different idea about what this church is. Each person that is driven by may have an idea about what this church is, what we stand for. And each person that we've spoken to about this church almost assuredly has a different view of what this church is all about. Back in the first chapter of Romans 1, verse 8, we read Paul, of course, addressing the Romans. It says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world." Your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. What a challenge. That our faith would be spoken of throughout the whole world. Many of the churches that Paul wrote his letters to had major problems. Most, I would venture to say, if we saw churches that had the types of problems that some of the churches Paul wrote letters to, we would be certain that the Lord had removed the candlestick. That was certainly no longer a church. I don't know what to say about that other than that maybe the Lord is more long-suffering than we are. But I digress. So many of these churches that Paul writes to have major issues. And these churches with all these problems, he's not writing to them to talk about the weather, just talk about how things are going. No, he rarely talks very much about what he's doing. He spends the bulk of his letters to these churches trying to teach them, telling them, in many cases, the problems and the strifes that he's heard about. And again, another reminder, how are these things getting back to Paul? Likely through other Christians. God forbid, not other Christians, lost people. That's a really, really bad testimony if that's, word starts getting around about how bad things are in a church and the lost world is talking about it. But Paul says he usually writes them to correct, to chastise these churches. But Paul says the Christians in Rome have a positive testimony. Again, almost none of these people that have spoken of their faith here have likely visited Rome. Travel was not simple in these times, but their service, the Roman service to God, was such that word of it traveled throughout the region. Likely part of this was that they were in Rome. Again, Rome was easily the most important city in the world and was almost assuredly spoken about frequently throughout the Roman Empire, of which Jerusalem and Israel were a part. Because of their location, they were perhaps more commonly spoken of than churches in smaller cities. This is just an assumption I'm making. I could be wrong. But we have a similar, although not completely analogous, situation today in this church. While we are not, of course, in the largest, most important city in the world, we are located in the metro area of one of the largest cities in our circle of fellowship, let's say. And I don't think that this church is on the tips of the tongues of our sister churches in smaller areas frequently. But we do receive more visitors from sister churches than most others. All of these brothers and sisters that have visited us, what do they say about us when they go back to their home church? I've spoken to several preachers, inviting them to come preach for us, and of course even inviting a few to come and preach in view of a call. And these preachers that I call that don't know us as well, the ones that I'm inviting to come and preach for us, I always tell them a little bit about the church. And what I typically say is, we're a small church, but we're filled with people that love the Lord and know and love the truths of the Bible. And I believe that to be true, or else I wouldn't say it. I love this church. I've been to a lot of churches. I've seen a lot of churches that aren't as grounded in the important truths and doctrines as this church is. And that's not for us to pat us on the back, but it's true. To be frank, it makes it a little bit more challenging for us to find a pastor, because we have very strong views on what we believe the Bible teaches, and I believe we're right in those views, and so we should be very selective. That doesn't mean that we're the world's greatest church and we can only have the world's greatest man. Obviously, that's not the case. But this church is well taught, and I thank the Lord for that. That's only by the grace of God, and let us not forget that. But we need to ask ourselves today, what do we want people to say about this church? This is an important time to ask ourselves that question. We are in a transitional phase right now. We're obviously between pastors. Dave, John, and myself are doing our best to guide this church. And please pray for us. I mean that sincerely. I believe most or all of you are, and I thank you for that. Please continue. And I'm sure not everyone agrees with everything that we say or do. And that's fine. Please just pray for us. Let us not hold our disagreements close, ever. But especially not at this time. So, like I said, we're between pastors. Let us not wait to ask ourselves this question until we have a pastor. What do we want people to say about this church? Our reputation, our identity, shouldn't just be whomever our current pastor is. The position of pastor is more fluid, generally, than the membership. The vast majority of us have seen this church pastored by multiple men. If we are waiting on a pastor to decide what we're about, then we are a ship that is off course and possibly already sunk. The church is not the pastor. The position of pastor is obviously important, and my intention is not to downplay that at all. The pastor is ordained by God to lead, protect, and to teach the church. But, again, the pastor is not the church. The pastor is a member of the church. As I said before, he has more responsibilities. But if we are sitting back and waiting for the pastor to make this church great, it's never going to happen. It's not all about the pastor. I've seen this, and maybe this is part of my perspective as a pastor's child, but I've seen many churches where the church membership is content to sit back and let the pastor do everything. They'll still disagree with them from time to time, but they put all the responsibility over what the church is, what the church teaches, what outreach the church does, how well the church attendance is going, how well the church finances are going. All of these things are on the pastor. And that's ridiculous. You know, again, this might be partially from my perspective of a pastor's child. I've been on the inside of these things, and I've also been close enough to see these kinds of things in other churches. But again, the church is not the pastor. we don't have a pastor right now. We're obviously not folding up shop. We are to continue on, whether we have a pastor or not. Obviously, we want to have a pastor as soon as possible. But we want what the Lord has for us. If what the Lord has for us is 2 years from now, and I pray that that's not the case. But if it is 2 years from now, then you know what? We have to serve the Lord, and this church will continue to be a church, and we will continue to be a bodily member of this church that has a job to do until and through that time when we have a pastor. This church has had times throughout its history where the pastor wasn't living up to his responsibilities. When that happens, it doesn't just reflect poorly on that man. It reflects poorly on the church. It reflects poorly on each and every one of us. Again, what do we want people to say about this church? What do we want to be all about? We need to decide these things now before we call a pastor. This time is an opportunity to confirm in our hearts what it is that we stand for. It's much more difficult to do that when we already have a pastor steering the ship. One of the ways that we do that is in the questioning of a potential pastor. We prioritize what aspects of a pastor are most important to us. By doing that, we are saying what we want to be. But it's much, much more than just that. This is something that, maybe not more important, but at least equally, we need to look at on a personal level. Each of us, each and every member, has responsibility in deciding what this church will be. A benefit of a small church such as this is that it is easier to make a positive difference. Now, the flip side of that is, it is also easier to make a negative difference. It's easier to be a distraction. But for now, let's focus on the positive. If you want the church to be more loving, be more loving. If you want the church to be more missionary focused, be more missionary focused. If you want the church to be closer, work on those relationships. If you want the church to be more prayerful, work on your prayer life. If you want the church to be known as a church that loves its pastors, begin right now praying for our next pastor. And start thinking about how you can be a blessing to him. Let us not be idle during this time without a pastor. Let us decide to be a better church. The best way to do that, be a better Christian. It's a challenge, obviously, that is simple in declaration, but difficult in execution. Let us challenge ourselves to be better Christians, to be better church members, and to make this an even better church. Let's build the love in this church by loving. Build the closeness in the church by working on relationships. Build the unity in the church by humbling yourself and working towards unity. Build a culture of prayer in the church by praying without ceasing. Paul, as we said, had never been to Rome, but he had heard glowing reports about the Christians based there. Let us strive to be spoken of as the Romans to the world around us. I have more here, but I'm going to stop on that note. It seems likely at this point that we'll be coming back to look at the book of Romans in some future studies. But for tonight, let us dedicate the rest of this week to asking ourselves and praying over what do we want people to say about this church? What do we want to be all about? Let's go.